When Alice went for a job interview at a well-known company, she faced clear bias. The interviewer openly humiliated her, not believing in her abilities. But no one knew who she really was. What happened at the end turned everything upside down. Want to know how it ended? Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. It was a bright, crisp morning when Alice Parker arrived at the towering glass building of Calder and Fisher, one of the most prestigious financial firms in the city. As she stood outside, taking in the grandiosity of the structure before her, she couldn't help but feel a slight twinge of nervousness. It wasn't the kind of anxiety that came from doubt in her abilities. No, Alice was more than qualified for this position. She had years of experience in finance, having navigated the toughest corners of the industry and consistently proving her worth. What troubled her was something far more insidious, something she'd encountered too many times in her career: prejudice. Alice had dealt with her fair share of skepticism, not because of her qualifications or achievements, but because of her skin color. At 34, she was a black woman who had broken through many barriers, only to find new ones waiting at the next door. And today, standing in front of this imposing structure, she wondered how many more walls she'd have to tear down. The lobby of Calder and Fisher was as grand as one would expect from such a company. Marble floors that seemed to stretch for miles, pristine glass walls, and sleek modern furniture that spoke of wealth and exclusivity. Alice straightened her blazer, took a deep breath, and walked confidently toward the reception desk. She was here for an interview, but it was no ordinary interview. What the firm didn't know was that Alice was not just a candidate. She was their future partner, someone who had already been vetted and chosen to lead a major transformation within the company. This interview was more a test for them than for her. As she approached the desk, the receptionist, a young woman in a sharp black suit, barely looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked in a monotone voice, her eyes fixed on her computer screen. "Yes, I'm here for an interview with Mr. Howard," Alice replied, keeping her tone professional. The receptionist finally lifted her gaze, her eyes scanning Alice with the kind of indifference that bordered on disdain. "And you are?" she asked, clearly not expecting Alice to be anyone of significance. "Alice Parker," she responded with a calm smile, not allowing the receptionist's coldness to affect her. She'd seen this kind of behavior before, an assumption that she didn't belong, that she was out of place in such a prestigious environment. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, as if she were about to say something dismissive, but then she simply nodded and picked up the phone. "Mr. Howard, your 9 a.m. is here," she said into the receiver before hanging up and motioning toward a row of chairs. "You can wait over there." Alice walked over to the seating area, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. As she sat, she could feel the eyes of several employees passing by, casting quick, judgmental glances her way. She had dressed impeccably, wearing a tailored suit that commanded respect, yet the expressions on their faces were all too familiar: doubt, suspicion, even mild disdain. It wasn't just about her appearance. It was about the unspoken question that lingered in their gazes. What is she doing here? Sitting there, Alice's mind drifted to the many times she had faced these same looks throughout her career. She remembered her first job interview right out of college, where the hiring manager had been visibly surprised by her qualifications. She remembered the condescending comments from colleagues who had assumed she was hired to fill some diversity quota. And she remembered the countless times clients had asked to speak with someone more experienced, only to realize, too late, that she was the most experienced person in the room. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A man in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a sharply cut suit, approached her. This was Mr. Howard, the man who would be conducting her interview. His expression was neutral, but there was a subtle air of superiority in the way he carried himself, as if he had already made up his mind about her. "Miss Parker," he said, extending a hand. I'm Stephen Howard. Shall we? Alice rose to her feet, taking his hand in a firm shake. Pleasure to meet you, she said, her voice steady and professional. Howard led her down a long hallway, their footsteps echoing off the glass walls. As they walked, Alice could feel the weight of the upcoming conversation settling on her shoulders. This was not going to be an easy interview, but then again, nothing about her career had been easy. They arrived at a spacious conference room, with large windows overlooking the city skyline. Howard gestured for her to sit, and she complied, taking her place at the long glass table. He took a seat across from her, pulling out a thick folder that presumably contained her resume and application materials. "So, Miss Parker," he began, flipping through the pages, "tell me why you think you're qualified for a position at Calder and Fisher." There it was, the first test. Alice had expected this. She could sense that Howard had already formed a biased opinion before even reviewing her qualifications. She took a breath and began to outline her experience, her years managing high-profile clients, leading successful projects, and consistently exceeding performance goals. She spoke clearly and confidently, leaving no room for doubt about her abilities. But Howard didn't seem impressed. His eyes drifted back and forth from her resume to her, his expression unchanging. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Your resume is interesting," he said slowly. "But I have to ask, have you ever worked with clients at this level before? Calder and Fisher handles some of the most exclusive accounts in the world. Our clients have very high expectations. I'm not sure I see anything in your background that suggests you're prepared for that kind of pressure." Alice felt a flicker of frustration, but she kept her face composed. She had been prepared for these kinds of questions, challenges to her competence, to her right to be sitting in that chair. It was a tactic she had faced many times, often from people who couldn't see past her skin color. "I assure you," she replied calmly, "I've worked with high-profile clients throughout my career. In fact, I've managed accounts that exceeded expectations consistently, even under tight deadlines and complex financial structures. I'm more than capable of handling the responsibilities that come with this role." Howard tilted his head slightly, his expression one of mild skepticism. "I'm sure you believe that," he said, his tone condescending. "But Calder and Fisher isn't just another firm. We're on a different level. Our clients expect more than just competence. They expect someone who understands their world, someone who fits." The implication in his words was clear. He didn't believe she could fit in this world, not because of her skills, but because of something else, something unspoken but painfully obvious. Alice met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I understand the expectations of your clients," she said, her voice firm. "I've worked in high-pressure environments, and I've succeeded. I don't just meet expectations, I exceed them." Howard stared at her for a long moment, his fingers still tapping the table. The silence in the room was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Alice could feel the weight of his judgment, the way he was measuring her not just by her words, but by something deeper, something more insidious. Finally, he spoke. "Let's continue," he said, his tone dismissive. He clearly wasn't convinced. For the next half hour, Howard drilled her with question after question, each one designed to undermine her confidence, to make her doubt her own abilities. He asked about her experience with specific financial models, about her leadership style, about her ability to handle clients who, as he put it, require a certain level of sophistication. His tone remained condescending throughout, as if he didn't believe she could possibly rise to the occasion. But Alice didn't falter. She answered every question with precision, drawing on her years of experience and expertise. She wasn't going to let him undermine her, no matter how hard he tried. By the time the interview was nearing its end, the tension in the room was palpable. Howard finally closed the folder and looked at her with a faint, patronizing smile. "Well, Miss Parker," he said, "I think that's all for now. We'll be in touch." Alice stood, extending her hand once again. "Thank you for your time," she said, keeping her tone polite, though she could feel the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Howard shook her hand briefly, his grip limp, before turning away. Alice walked out of the conference room, her steps steady and deliberate. As she made her way back through the gleaming hallways of Calder and Fisher, the weight of the interview still hung heavy on her. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but even she hadn't expected the blatant condescension she had just faced. But what Howard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this wasn't the end of the story. Alice exited the conference room, the crispness of her steps echoing down the long glass corridor. She kept her face composed, her posture strong. But inside, the sting of the interview gnawed at her. The air of condescension from Stephen Howard was palpable, and his words continued to ring in her mind like a bad echo. She knew that walking into this room, she would face certain challenges, but nothing could have prepared her for how deep-rooted his dismissiveness had been. Her entire life, Alice had been breaking through these walls, fighting battles on multiple fronts. At times, the subtle microaggressions felt just as sharp as open hostility. Comments cloaked in professional tones, expressions of doubt delivered with feigned politeness. This wasn't just about a bad interview or a tough interviewer. It was about the years of being seen as less than, and today had been no different. She glanced at the towering windows that framed the city skyline, a view only someone like Stephen Howard would take for granted. Calder and Fisher, a financial empire built by men like him, white, privileged, groomed from birth to believe they belonged at the top, while everyone else, especially someone like Alice, had to prove they even deserved to be in the room. As she approached the reception area once again, she noticed a group of employees walking through the lobby, whispering amongst themselves. Their glances, furtive, judgmental, made it clear what they thought. She didn't belong. Alice straightened her shoulders and reminded herself that these people had no idea who she truly was. By the time she reached the elevators, the tension she'd been holding in her chest finally began to ease. The interview was over, but her work had just begun. In her mind, she replayed the questions Howard had thrown at her. The thinly veiled doubts, the condescending smirks, the way he'd spoken as if she was somehow beneath the level Calder and Fisher demanded. His words had been crafted with precision, each one designed to chip away at her confidence, to make her feel out of place, out of her league. But Alice had handled it with grace. She hadn't given him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She knew, deep down, that his reaction wasn't about her capabilities. It was about something far more ingrained. Howard wasn't just skeptical of her because of her qualifications. He was skeptical of her because of her race. That much had been clear from the moment she sat down. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She stepped into the elevator and pulled it out. A message from her assistant, Sarah. "How did it go? Everything on track?" Alice took a breath before responding. She knew Sarah had been rooting for her, had believed in her as much as anyone. But Sarah, young and optimistic, didn't yet fully understand the complexities Alice faced in rooms like this. To be a black woman in finance, to enter a room where you're the only one who looks like you, it wasn't just about being qualified. It was about fighting perceptions that had been built long before you ever arrived. "It went as expected," Alice texted back. "I'll explain when I get back." The elevator doors opened, and she stepped out into the busy lobby. Her heels clicked on the marble floor as she made her way toward the revolving doors. The cool morning air hit her as she stepped outside, offering a brief moment of relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the building. But the weight of the interview lingered. She couldn't shake Howard's voice, the way he had looked at her with that smug certainty, as if he had already decided she wasn't a fit, no matter what she said or did. He hadn't just doubted her abilities. He had doubted her entire right to be there. The memories of the interview, the questions, and his demeanor played over and over in her mind as she got into her car and started the engine. The drive back to her office felt longer than usual, every street light and traffic signal offering her more time to reflect on the conversation. The further she drove, the more she thought about Howard's approach. His condescension had been laced with a certain restraint. He knew how to play the game, keeping just shy of saying something overtly offensive, but not hiding the implicit bias in his words either. She recalled the moment when, after she had confidently outlined her experience managing high-profile clients, he had leaned back in his chair and said, "I'm sure you've done well in your arena." His arena. The words had been chosen carefully. It was the verbal equivalent of drawing a line in the sand. Howard had set up a boundary between her and the world he considered his own, implying that whatever she had accomplished, it was on a smaller, less important stage. In his eyes, her experience didn't compare to the real world of Calder and Fisher, a world he clearly believed was reserved for people like him. Alice had kept her face neutral, even as her blood simmered beneath the surface. She had spent too many years perfecting the art of maintaining her composure under pressure, especially in the face of such blatant patronization. But that didn't mean the words hadn't cut deep. Howard hadn't stopped there either. He had gone on to ask about her handling of sophisticated clients, emphasizing the word as if she wouldn't understand what it meant. The underlying message had been clear. People like her weren't capable of dealing with high-level, elite clients, the kind that Calder and Fisher prided itself on serving. Alice had responded coolly, outlining her extensive experience with multi-million-dollar accounts, detailing the successful projects she had led, but she could tell none of it mattered to Howard. His mind had already been made up before she even walked through the door. To him, she was just another candidate to dismiss, another woman who didn't fit the mold of what a Calder and Fisher executive should look like. The interview had reached its peak tension when Howard had flat-out questioned her ability to fit in with the company's culture. He had smirked as he asked it, leaning in slightly as if daring her to challenge the statement. Alice had known this was his attempt to undermine her, to make her doubt whether she belonged in a firm like his. For a brief moment, Alice had wanted to stand up and walk out. She had wanted to tell him that it wasn't her who didn't belong. It was people like him, people who held on to outdated, prejudiced beliefs, who didn't deserve to be in positions of power. But she had held her tongue. Instead, she had calmly explained her understanding of corporate culture, her experience leading teams and adapting to different environments. She hadn't given him the reaction he wanted, and she had seen the flash of frustration in his eyes when she didn't rise to his bait. Now, sitting in her car at a red light, Alice's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The morning sun glared through the windshield, and she squinted, her mind still replaying the condescending smirk on Howard's face as he wrapped up the interview with a perfunctory, "We'll be in touch." Alice knew what that meant. She had heard it before. In the corporate world, "We'll be in touch" was code for "don't hold your breath." But today wasn't like those other interviews. Howard had no idea who she really was or what kind of power she wielded, and that was going to make the next few days all the more satisfying. As she pulled into the parking garage beneath her own office building, Alice's thoughts shifted. This wasn't just about the interview anymore. Howard's attitude, his dismissiveness, it was a microcosm of the broader problems within the industry, problems she had been fighting her entire career. Calder and Fisher wasn't just another firm. It was a symbol of everything wrong with the old guard of finance. A world where privilege and power were hoarded by those who looked like Howard, while everyone else, especially black women like her, had to fight tooth and nail just to get a foot in the door. But what Howard didn't realize was that Alice wasn't here to knock on the door anymore. She was here to own the building. As she stepped out of her car and walked toward the elevator, Alice's mind shifted gears. She had gone through the motions with Howard, allowing him to dig his own grave with every patronizing comment, every dismissive glance. Now it was time to plan her next move. In her office, Sarah was waiting, her wide eyes full of questions. Alice smiled faintly as she sat down behind her desk. "So?" Sarah asked eagerly. "How did it really go?" Alice leaned back in her chair. Her fingers steepled thoughtfully. "It went exactly as expected," she said with a calm, measured tone. Sarah frowned, clearly confused. "But does that mean it was bad?" Alice shook her head slowly. Her gaze focused on something far beyond the walls of her office. "It means that Mr. Howard showed me exactly what I needed to see." Sarah blinked, still unsure what to make of the situation. "And what's that?" Alice smiled, a sharp, knowing smile that carried the weight of someone who had seen the truth behind the mask. "That he's about to learn a very important lesson." As Sarah opened her mouth to ask another question, Alice's phone buzzed. It was a call she had been expecting. She glanced at the screen, and the smile on her face deepened. "Excuse me, Sarah," she said, standing up and walking toward the window. "I think it's time we prepare for the real conversation." As she answered the call, Alice's gaze swept across the city skyline. The power dynamics were about to shift, and the next chapter of this story was hers to write. Alice stood by the window, her phone pressed to her ear as she listened to the familiar voice on the other end. It was one of the firm's senior partners, someone who had long admired her work from afar, and who had been instrumental in the decision to bring her on board as the newest partner at Calder and Fisher. But the voice today was different, calm but loaded with anticipation. "We've reviewed everything, Alice," the voice said. "You're exactly what we need to move forward. The rest of the partners are eager to see what you can bring to the firm. The only thing left is the formal announcement." Alice nodded to herself, still staring out at the towering skyline. The truth had been there all along, concealed under layers of formality and condescension. What Howard didn't know, and what none of the staff at Calder and Fisher had realized, was that the firm had already decided on its next major partner, and that partner was Alice Parker. "Let me guess," Alice replied, her voice measured but firm. "They want me to walk through another round of meetings to prove I belong here." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a soft chuckle. "Something like that, but don't worry, it's all a formality. They're already on board. We just want to give you the opportunity to meet the team more informally." Alice's jaw clenched. She had spent years proving herself, navigating a world that questioned her capabilities at every turn. Now, even after she had been chosen to join the firm, they wanted her to play this game one last time, to go through the motions so that her presence could be justified to people like Stephen Howard. "I'll be there," she said, her voice cool but determined. "And we'll make it clear why I belong." As the call ended, Alice turned back to her desk, where Sarah stood, still waiting for an explanation. The weight of what was about to happen hung in the air, thick and palpable. Alice sat down, her fingers tracing the edge of her desk, her mind already preparing for what was to come. The next day, Alice returned to Calder and Fisher, but this time the stakes were higher. The formalities were done, but the real test lay ahead. She was to meet with the senior partners of the firm, the old guard who had built Calder and Fisher into the powerhouse it was today. Howard would be there too. His smug face would no doubt be watching, waiting for her to falter. As Alice walked through the lobby, the stairs were the same, but this time she felt a different kind of tension building inside her. She wasn't just another candidate anymore. She was the future of this firm, and today was her chance to make sure everyone knew it. The conference room was filled with a dozen people, men mostly, with just a few women scattered among them. The energy in the room was unmistakable, a subtle, unspoken hierarchy of power that had been built over decades. Howard sat at the far end of the table, his eyes already fixed on Alice as she entered the room. His expression hadn't changed since their interview, that same condescending smirk still resting on his lips. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries. Introductions were made, and small talk flowed around the room. Alice played her part, shaking hands and exchanging professional niceties. But all the while, she could feel Howard's gaze lingering on her. She knew he was waiting for something, for her to slip up, to show some sign that she didn't belong here. But Alice wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Finally, the senior partner cleared his throat and brought the room to attention. "We've all had the chance to meet Alice informally over the last few days," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I think it's time we hear from her directly about her vision for the firm." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Alice. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She rose from her chair, every movement deliberate, her gaze steady as she looked around the room. The weight of their expectations hung heavy in the air, but Alice was ready. She had been ready for this her entire career. As Alice began to speak, outlining her ideas for modernizing Calder and Fisher, she could feel the tension in the room shift. Her vision was bold, revolutionary even. She spoke about the importance of diversifying the firm's client base, bringing in new voices and perspectives, and expanding their reach into underserved markets. But more than that, she emphasized the need for the firm itself to evolve, to break away from the old ways of thinking that had dominated the industry for too long. She didn't mention Howard by name, but everyone in the room knew exactly what she was referring to. The traditional power structures, the exclusivity, the subtle and sometimes not so subtle biases that had kept people like her from rising to positions of power for so long. All of it was about to change. As she continued, Alice noticed the subtle shifts in body language around the table. Some of the partners leaned in, intrigued by her ideas. Others sat back, arms crossed, clearly skeptical of the changes she was proposing. And then there was Howard, whose smirk had disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. When Alice finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then the senior partner spoke up. "Thank you, Alice," he said. "I think we can all agree that your vision is exactly what we need to move forward." But before anyone else could respond, Howard cleared his throat. "I'm not so sure," he said, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "These ideas are ambitious, but I'm not convinced they're realistic for a firm like Calder and Fisher. Our clients expect a certain level of continuity." The air in the room seemed to thicken as Howard's words hung in the air. He was challenging her, not just on her ideas, but on her right to be in this room. His tone was measured, professional, but the underlying message was clear. He didn't think she belonged here. He didn't believe she had what it took to lead this firm into the future. Alice met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "Continuity is important, of course," she said calmly, "but so is growth. If we don't adapt to the changing landscape, we risk falling behind. Our clients expect excellence, yes, but they also expect innovation. We can't afford to cling to the past if we want to remain competitive." Howard's eyes narrowed, but Alice didn't back down. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. He was testing her, pushing her to see if she would crumble under the pressure. But Alice had been here before. She had faced far worse than Stephen Howard, and she wasn't about to let him intimidate her now. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Howard," Alice continued, her voice steady. "But I believe we can balance tradition with progress. It's not about abandoning what's worked in the past. It's about building on it to create something even better." The room was silent again, and for a moment, Alice wondered if anyone would back her up. But then, one of the senior partners, a woman who had been quiet throughout the meeting, spoke up. "I think Alice is right," she said. "We need to be looking toward the future, not just maintaining the status quo. Her ideas are bold, yes, but that's exactly what we need if we want to stay ahead of the competition." One by one, others began to chime in, supporting Alice's vision. Even those who had seemed skeptical at first were beginning to come around. Howard's smirk had long since faded. and now he sat in stony silence, his expression unreadable. As the meeting drew to a close, the senior partner turned to Alice with a nod of approval. "Thank you for your insights, Alice," he said. "I think it's clear that you have a strong vision for the future of this firm. We'll be discussing the next steps with you in the coming days." The meeting adjourned, and the partners began to file out of the room, murmuring amongst themselves. Howard lingered behind, his eyes still fixed on Alice as she gathered her things. "Alice," he said, his voice low and measured. She turned to face him, her expression neutral. "Yes, Mr. Howard?" For a moment he said nothing, his eyes searching her face for something, perhaps weakness, perhaps fear. But Alice stood tall, her gaze unwavering. Finally, he spoke. "I hope you know what you're getting into. Calder and Fisher isn't the kind of place where change happens easily." Alice met his gaze, her eyes cold and sharp. "I'm not here to make things easy, Mr. Howard," she said. "I'm here to make them better." With that, she turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving Howard standing alone in the silence. He had tried to challenge her, to undermine her, but Alice had risen above it. She had shown him, and the rest of the firm, that she wasn't just another candidate. She was a leader, a force to be reckoned with, and Calder and Fisher was about to find out just how powerful she could be. Alice's heels clicked with steady determination as she walked through the halls of Calder and Fisher once again. The weight of the previous days hung in the air, and though she appeared calm and collected, inside, she felt the full brunt of the battle she had just waged. This wasn't just another day at the office. This was the culmination of years of effort, of pushing against every door that had been slammed in her face, of proving herself time and time again. As she approached the lobby, she noticed the usual crowd, employees and clients milling about, their conversations drifting through the air in quiet hums. But today, Alice felt different. Today, she was no longer a candidate walking through the doors of Calder and Fisher. Today, she was their new partner, though most of them didn't know it yet. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Another message from the senior partner she had spoken to earlier. It was time. "Ready for the big reveal?" the message read, followed by a quick confirmation of the meeting where her formal announcement would be made. Alice couldn't help but smile at the irony. Stephen Howard had no idea what was about to happen. The same man who had belittled her, who had doubted her every word, was about to find out that the woman he had dismissed was now one of the most powerful figures in the company. She took a deep breath, tucking her phone away as she prepared to walk into the room where everything would change. The conference room was filled with the senior leadership of Calder and Fisher, just as it had been the day before. Today, however, there was a different energy in the air. The atmosphere was tense, almost electric, as if everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. Alice entered the room, and for a brief moment, she felt the eyes of the entire leadership team on her. It wasn't an unfamiliar sensation. She had been under scrutiny her entire career. But today was different. Today, the scrutiny was about to turn into something else. Respect. Perhaps even admiration. Stephen Howard sat in the same chair at the far end of the table, his expression as unreadable as ever. He acknowledged Alice with a slight nod, the same smugness still resting on his face, unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down. The senior partner stood at the head of the table, his voice calm and authoritative as he called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming. Today we have an important announcement to make regarding the future of Calder and Fisher." Alice's heart raced slightly as she took her seat. This was it, the moment when everything she had worked for would come to fruition. The senior partner continued, his voice steady as he outlined the importance of the firm's future direction, the need for innovation, and the desire to bring in new perspectives to guide the firm forward. "As you know," he said, "we've been in the process of selecting a new partner to help lead Calder and Fisher into the next phase of our growth. Today I'm pleased to announce that we've made our decision." The room fell silent as everyone waited in anticipation. Alice could feel the tension building, but she remained calm. She had been preparing for this moment for her entire life. The senior partner turned to her, a slight smile on his face. "Alice Parker will be joining Calder and Fisher as our newest partner." The room seemed to freeze for a moment. There was a brief, stunned silence as the words sank in. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. Surprised whispers, exchanged glances, a few raised eyebrows. The shock was palpable, but nothing compared to the expression on Stephen Howard's face. His smug grin vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of pure disbelief. His eyes widened, his face paling as he realized what had just happened. Alice met his gaze, her expression calm and composed. She didn't need to say anything. The look on his face said it all. The man who had spent days questioning her qualifications, dismissing her abilities, had just found out that she was not only his equal, but his superior. Howard blinked, his mouth opening slightly, as if to say something, but no words came out. He glanced around the room, as if hoping someone else would express the same disbelief he felt. But the rest of the senior partners seemed to be taking the news in stride, some even nodding approvingly. "Alice," the senior partner said, "would you like to say a few words?" Alice stood, her movements deliberate and controlled. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room, before finally settling on Howard. He looked as though he was still trying to process what had just happened, his hands clenched tightly on the table in front of him. "Thank you," Alice began, her voice clear and steady. "I'm honored to be joining Calder and Fisher as a partner, and I look forward to working with all of you to continue building on the firm's legacy of excellence." She paused, her gaze once again locking onto Howard. "I believe that together we can take this firm to new heights, but in order to do that, we must be willing to embrace change, to challenge the status quo, and to open our minds to new perspectives." There it was, the subtle challenge. Alice had deliberately chosen her words, knowing full well that they would strike a chord with Howard. He had spent their entire interview dismissing her ideas as too radical, too different. But now, he was in no position to argue. He had no choice but to accept that the future of Calder and Fisher would be shaped by the very ideas he had tried to undermine. As Alice finished her brief remarks, the room broke into polite applause. Some of the partners even stood to shake her hand, offering their congratulations. Howard, however, remained seated, his face still pale, his hands still clenched. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't seen it coming. And now, he was faced with the reality that the very person he had tried to dismiss was now in a position of power over him. The meeting concluded, and as the other partners began to file out of the room, Alice noticed Howard lingering behind. His expression was tight, his jaw clenched as he rose from his seat. She knew what was coming, a private confrontation, the last attempt to regain some semblance of control. He approached her slowly, his eyes narrowing as he finally spoke. "Alice," he said, his voice low and strained. "I didn't see this coming." Alice turned to face him, her expression calm and collected. "I know you didn't," she replied evenly. That was the point. Howard's eyes flashed with frustration, but he quickly regained his composure. "You've made your point clearly," he said, his tone tinged with resentment. "But I hope you understand that this won't be easy. Calder and Fisher isn't the kind of place where change happens overnight." "I'm not expecting it to happen overnight," Alice replied, her voice cool but firm. "But it will happen, and you'll either be part of that change or you'll be left behind." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Howard's face darkened, his frustration barely concealed. For a moment, Alice thought he might say something more, but instead, he simply nodded, his expression grim. "I suppose we'll see," he muttered, before turning and walking out of the room. Alice watched him go, her heart racing slightly as the weight of the confrontation settled in. She had known this wouldn't be easy. People like Howard didn't give up power without a fight. But she was ready for it. She had spent her entire career fighting for her place in rooms like this. And now, finally, she was where she belonged. As Alice left the conference room, the reality of her new position began to sink in. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, resistance from people like Howard who would fight to maintain the old ways. But Alice had never been one to back down from a fight. She made her way through the halls of Calder and Fisher, the eyes of the employees following her as she passed. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with respect. But there were still those who watched with thinly veiled judgment, their expressions mirroring the same doubts Howard had voiced during their interview. They didn't believe she belonged here. Not yet. But they would. Alice smiled to herself as she reached the elevator. The power dynamics at Calder and Fisher were shifting, and she was at the center of it. For too long, people like her had been kept out of rooms like this, their voices silenced, their potential overlooked. But no longer. She was here to stay, and the future of Calder and Fisher would be shaped by her vision, whether the old guard liked it or not. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Alice felt a sense of calm settle over her. The truth had been revealed, and the power was finally in her hands. And this was only the beginning. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new exciting stories. Click the bell to be the first to know about our new videos. Also, be sure to check out our other stories. There are many more unexpected things waiting for you. Leave your comments and share where you saw this video.